Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little trip back in time. So dim the lights, maybe curl under a blanket, and let's glide into the warm, slightly awkward and occasionally sticky world of ancient Pompeii. Now, if you're wondering why Pompeii is always the setting for these late-night history rambles, the answer is pretty simple. It got buried in ash, and because of that we basically got an ancient time capsule, which is wonderful for historians and mildly horrifying for the people involved. They didn't survive, but their walls, their graffiti, and yes, their brothels did. And so now we get to peek inside the daily lives of Romans in a way we usually can't. So let's imagine you're a tired Roman man around the year 70 CE. You've spent the day sweating over amphorae of wine, or haggling in the marketplace, or pretending to care about your wife's cousin's poetry recital. And now you're looking for some extracurricular entertainment. Enter the lupanar. That's the Latin word for brothel, and yes, it comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf, which tells you something about Roman metaphors. Now, the lupanar of Pompeii is the most famous surviving brothel from the ancient world. It's a two-story building with 10 tiny rooms, and it sits on a street that, according to the archaeologists, was basically the red light district, which is always fun to think about. Tourists like to imagine that the Romans had respectable areas and naughty areas, and yeah, that's basically correct. Pompeii had bakeries, taverns, temples, and right next to them, places where you could grab a quick transactional cuddle. Because zoning laws weren't exactly a thing, so what was it like to walk in? Well, first off, the rooms were small, like closet small. Stone beds with thin straw mattresses, not the plush velvet you see in Hollywood. More like, congratulations, here's a stone slab, don't sprain your back. And on the walls, frescoes, but not just any frescoes. These were very detailed menu boards, if you catch my drift. Imagine going into McDonald's, but instead of pictures of cheeseburgers, you get enthusiastic paintings of all the different services available. It was marketing, Roman style. And because Romans loved leaving graffiti everywhere, we also have customer reviews scratched into the walls. Some are glowing endorsements like, "Metha made me spill like a bucket," and some are less enthusiastic. One guy carved, "Celadus the gladiator makes the girls moan," which is either bragging about himself or about his favorite rival. Hard to tell. Either way, it shows that even in 79 CE, people loved leaving petty comments in public bathrooms and brothels. Yelp reviews are eternal. Now, visiting a brothel wasn't some rare, shameful activity. Roman men were pretty casual about it. Married, unmarried, old, young, didn't matter. Respectable men could stroll in without worrying too much about scandal. The only people really frowned upon were women of good families who weren't supposed to be seen anywhere near the lupanar. Though let's be real, some definitely snuck in. Speaking of women, let's talk about the workers. The majority of Pompeii's prostitutes were enslaved, which puts a much darker undertone on all of this. They were often Greek, Syrian, or from other provinces of the empire, and they had basically no say in the matter. Their lives were controlled, their earnings went to an owner, and the work was relentless. So while the walls give us colorful frescoes and cheeky graffiti, the lived reality was probably exhausting and depressing. The irony, of course, is that the customers thought they were the ones escaping daily life. And because Rome loved bureaucracy, prostitution was regulated. Women had to register with the authorities, and there were taxes involved. Yes, the Roman state was making money off of this too. So imagine you're living in Pompeii, scraping together coins, and part of those taxes are funding public baths and aqueducts, thanks to someone else's trip to the lupanar. Civilization, ladies and gentlemen. Let's pause and float over to some of the stranger details. For instance, there are little carved stone penises along Pompeii's streets that acted as, essentially, advertisements and directional signs. They pointed you toward the brothel in case you got lost, which is both helpful and hilarious. Picture it, you're staggering out of a wine tavern and there's a cheerful little phallic arrow guiding you to your destination. Subtlety was not the Roman way. Now, if you're wondering how much this all cost, well, we have evidence of that too. The going rate was about 2 asses. And no, that's not a joke. The Roman currency was called an as. 2 asses would be about the price of a loaf of bread or a cup of cheap wine. So yes, incredibly affordable, which explains the high volume of graffiti left behind. But here's a fun twist. The Lupanar was also a bit of a tourist stop. In modern times, that is. Ever since Pompeii was excavated in the 18th century, the brothel has been a major attraction. Victorian visitors were scandalized, but also couldn't resist peeking. The frescoes were considered so obscene that many were locked away in what was called the Gabinetto Segreto, the secret cabinet, at the Naples Museum. Only serious male scholars were allowed to see them, which is basically the 19th century version of hiding magazines under the bed. And today, the brothel is still one of the busiest stops on Pompeii tours, which is slightly surreal. Families with kids wander through those tiny stone rooms, peeking at frescoes of very flexible people, while guides try to give historical context without blushing. The workers of 79 CE probably never imagined their workplace would become a UNESCO attraction. But let's not stay stuck in Pompeii too long, because Rome wasn't unique here. Ancient brothels existed everywhere from Athens to Alexandria. Some were state-run, like in classical Greece, where the city of Athens literally managed public brothels and used the revenue to fund temples. So, the Parthenon might have been partly financed by prostitution taxes. Next time someone tells you, classical architecture is pure and noble, just remember that. Still, Pompeii's brothel stands out because it survived in such pristine, awkward detail. You can practically hear the voices echoing. A tired man negotiating with a bored, enslaved girl, someone carving his name on the wall to show he'd been there. The sound of footsteps on the stone floor, and then the silence as the volcanic ash buried it all. The final frozen yelp review. Now, since this is a bedtime history ramble, we're not rushing anywhere. Let's drift gently into a connected topic, the general Roman attitude toward sex. Because the brothel only makes sense if you understand the cultural backdrop. Romans didn't really have the same hang-ups about sex that medieval Europeans later did. For Roman men, masculinity was tied to dominance, not chastity. So as long as you were the active partner, society didn't care much who the passive partner was. Woman, man, slave, prostitute. It was more about status and control than morality, which is why the graffiti at Pompeii is so blunt. Nobody was shy about it, but of course this came with hypocrisy. Elite men bragged about their affairs while women were tightly policed. A wife could be divorced for adultery, while her husband could wander the red light district nightly without consequence. Power dynamics everywhere, even in bed. One particularly telling story is of Emperor Caligula. Yes, that Caligula, the poster child for bad Roman emperors. He was rumored to have turned part of his palace into a brothel at one point, with senators' wives serving the clients. Which sounds outrageous, but with Caligula, it's always hard to know where the gossip ends and reality begins. Still, the fact that people believed it says a lot about how Romans linked politics, sex, and humiliation. So while Pompeii's Lupanar is our most tangible evidence, it was really just one brick in a much larger cultural wall. To Romans, sex was public, transactional, and endlessly discussed, which is why 2,000 years later, we're still giggling at their graffiti. Let's float one more step outward, because I want to linger in this sleepy, ash-covered city a little longer. Pompeii wasn't just home to one brothel. It had dozens of taverns and inns where prostitution also happened. Basically, anywhere. There were travelers and wine. There was probably someone offering company for a price. The official lupanar just centralized the business, and when Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it preserved all of this mid-motion. Imagine it, the frescoes on the walls still bright, the graffiti still legible, the tiny rooms empty but frozen, the street signs with carved stone penises still pointing the way, a whole corner of everyday Roman life sealed away under volcanic ash, waiting for modern tourists to come chuckle and blush. So, what was it like to visit a brothel in Pompeii? Crowded, transactional, a bit uncomfortable, but also weirdly normalized. A place where frescoes advertised the menu, graffiti served as Yelp, and two asses got you a quick encounter. Not glamorous, not romantic, just part of daily life. And with that, let's gently drift to another corner of Roman daily life. Because Pompeii had plenty of awkward little secrets to share. Bathhouses, graffiti, and awkward Roman habits? Hey again. So we just wandered out of Pompeii's lupanar, brushed some imaginary ash off our togas, and now we're strolling down the cobbled streets. Maybe you're feeling a little grimy after all that history. Lucky for you, the Romans had the perfect solution, the bathhouse. Now, Roman bathhouses were not like modern spas. Forget cucumber water and fluffy robes. This was more like a cross between a public swimming pool, a gym, and a gossip hub. Everyone went. Rich, poor, old, young. You'd pay a small entrance fee, sometimes literally just a coin, and you could hang out all afternoon, which sounds kind of great if you ignore the part where dozens of sweaty strangers were sharing the same lukewarm pool. Pompeii had several bath complexes, and they were surprisingly sophisticated. Heated floors, hot rooms, cold plunge pools, steam rooms that would put modern saunas to shame. And, because this is Rome, the walls were covered in frescoes, not always scandalous, sometimes just decorative, but occasionally spiced up with mythological figures who weren't exactly dressed for winter. Romans liked their decor with a side of cheek. So, what did you actually do in a bathhouse? Well, first you stripped completely naked. Romans weren't shy about that. Then you'd oil yourself up because soap wasn't really their thing. You'd rub olive oil all over your skin and then scrape it off with a tool called a strigil. Imagine everyone in the room glistening and scraping like a human car wash, relaxing in a weird way. After the scrape, you'd cycle through the hot rooms and cold pools, chat with friends, maybe catch a lecture because sometimes philosophers gave talks in the baths. You could even grab a snack, since vendors hung around selling wine and bread. Basically, it was the ancient Roman version of going to the mall, except with more nudity. Now, because this is Pompeii, we also have graffiti from the bathhouses. Romans were prolific doodlers. They scratched little messages everywhere. Apollinaris, doctor of the emperor's gladiators, had a good bath, or more bluntly, Secundus loves Iris. Some were poetic, some were crude, but all of them remind us that even 2,000 years ago, people liked carving "I was here" into bathroom walls. Speaking of graffiti, let's pause and appreciate just how much of it Pompeii left us. Over 10,000 pieces of graffiti have been found on its walls. That's an entire Twitter feed carved into stone. Political slogans, love notes, insults, jokes. One person wrote, "We two dear men, friends forever, were here. If you want to know our names, they are Gaius and Aulus," which is kind of sweet. Another wrote, "Restitutus has deceived many girls. Less sweet, but very on brand for ancient frat boys." Some graffiti was even practical. One reads, "On April 19th, I baked bread." A man simply documenting his day. Maybe he was proud. Maybe he was bored. Either way, now we know. Another scratched into a wall. "We have wet the bed. I admit we were wrong, my host." That one raises questions. But again, it shows us that ancient Pompeii was full of messy humans, not marble statues. Of course, not all Roman habits were charming. Let's drift to the topic of toilets, because Pompeii had those too, and you might as well know about them before we wander further. Public latrines were common. Long benches with holes, lined up side by side, no partitions. You'd sit shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, doing your business and chatting about politics. Privacy wasn't really a Roman concern, and toilet paper, not quite. Instead, they used a sponge on a stick, shared communally, dipped in vinegar between uses, which makes the brothel stone beds suddenly sound luxurious. Hygiene was, let's say, functional, but let's float back to something lighter: food. Pompeii had fast food joints everywhere called thermopolia. They looked like modern street food counters, with big jars sunk into stone counters filled with hot dishes. Imagine walking down the street, grabbing a bowl of lentils and heading off. Because yes, Romans did take out. Excavations have even found the remains of food in those jars: lentils, beans, olives, fish stew, and occasionally fancier stuff like duck bones or snail shells. They loved their garum too. That was a fermented fish sauce, absolutely beloved across the empire. Think of soy sauce, but smellier. Pliny the Elder described it as exquisite, which tells us more about Roman taste buds than we maybe wanted to know. So a day in Pompeii might look like this. You roll out of bed. Maybe you swing by a bakery. You grab a loaf of bread, stamped with the baker's mark, because branding existed. Even then, later you head to the baths, scrape yourself down with olive oil, gossip with your friends. Maybe you stop at a thermopolium for lunch. Beans and fish sauce, delicious in its own special way. And in the evening, if you're feeling frisky, you follow the carved stone phallus signs to the lupanar. Daily life 2,000 years ago, preserved under ash. Now, before we drift too far into cozy routines, let's add a little sprinkle of awkward Roman medicine. Because if you got sick in Pompeii, your options weren't great. Doctors existed, but their remedies were creative. For example, to treat epilepsy, some recommended drinking the blood of a slain gladiator. For a sore throat, gargle with vinegar and goat fat. And for general health, wear amulets shaped like, you guessed it, little penises. Romans believed phallic charms warded off evil spirits. So if you see a necklace shaped like one in a museum, that wasn't jewelry for fun, it was protection. And again, this was all part of the same cultural mindset that normalized the brothel, the graffiti, the bathhouse banter. Pompeii was a city that didn't separate the sacred from the silly. Everything blended together. A temple here, a tavern next door, a mural of Hercules beside a scribbled insult about someone's mother. Life in all its messy, sometimes gross, sometimes funny detail. Let's close this part by walking through Pompeii's streets one last time before we wander on. The ruts of cartwheels are still carved into the stone paving. The bakeries still have their ovens. The amphitheater still echoes with the idea of gladiatorial games. And of course, the lupanar still stands, with its tiny rooms and its frescoes. A whole city caught in the middle of an ordinary day, as if history itself pressed pause. All right, we'll leave Pompeii's bustling little ash-covered streets here, and in the next part, we'll drift forward in time. Because while ancient Roman brothels are fascinating, later centuries had their own awkward and dysfunctional approaches to sex, power, and public scandal. Medieval Europe, I'm looking at you. Medieval brothels, hypocritical morality, and royal scandals. Hey guys. So we've left behind the fresco-covered walls of Pompeii, and we're stepping into the dim candlelight of medieval Europe. The baths are gone, the strigils are gone, and honestly, most of the hygiene is gone too, but brothels, those definitely stuck around. Now, the funny thing about the Middle Ages is that, while the church was loudly preaching about sin and chastity, cities across Europe were quietly running municipal brothels. Yes, you heard that right. Local governments literally operated brothels as public utilities, because apparently the logic went like this: men are going to sin anyway, so we might as well regulate it, tax it, and keep it tidy. Which is peak medieval problem-solving. Paris, for example, had entire licensed red light districts. The most famous was the Rue des Lombards, where the city ran official houses with fixed prices and rules. The church turned a blind eye as long as the money kept flowing. In some towns, bishops even rented out properties to be used as brothels. Nothing says holier than thou quite like collecting rent from sex workers. And then there was Avignon. When the papacy moved there in the 14th century, the town exploded with brothels. Pilgrims came to see the Pope, but they also found plenty of side entertainment. The papal city basically became the Las Vegas of its time. Holy on one street, rowdy on the next. Now, life in a medieval brothel wasn't exactly glamorous. Much like Pompeii's lupanar, the rooms were cramped, the bedding questionable, and the workers often had little choice in their profession. Many were poor women, some were trafficked, and others were simply caught in desperate circumstances. Clients were a mix of merchants, students, and the occasional noble sneaking in under a hood, and just like in Pompeii, prices were surprisingly cheap. In 14th century London, a visit to a Suffolk brothel cost about the price of a chicken. Yes, a chicken. Economists like to calculate these things, because nothing says serious history like comparing poultry to prostitution. Suffolk, by the way, was London's official red light district, just across the river from the city. The brothels there were called the stews, because, well, they often had bathhouse elements too. And guess who owned much of the property? The Bishop of Winchester. That's right, the church once again profited from sin. Prostitutes in Suffolk were even nicknamed Winchester geese, and if they died, they weren't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. Instead, they were dumped in a special graveyard, so the bishop got their money in life and denied them peace in death. Medieval morality at its finest. Now, medieval brothels weren't only about sex. They doubled as taverns, gambling halls, and rumour mills. Imagine a smoky room filled with ale, dice games, arguments about politics, and a few hired musicians in the corner. For many men, they weren't just a place for vice. They were a kind of social club. The line between brothel and bar was blurry. Of course, all of this clashed with the church's official stance on chastity, so sermons constantly thundered against fallen women, while city officials happily collected taxes from them. And kings were no better. Henry IV of Castile, for example, was nicknamed the Impotent, and gossip about his inability to consummate his marriage filled every tavern. And meanwhile, French kings like Charles VI spent their reigns either losing their minds or, in his case, literally thinking he was made of glass. But even then, brothels carried on under royal noses because shutting them down was simply impractical. Let's drift over to one of the more absurd medieval scandals, the University of Paris. Students in the 13th and 14th centuries were notorious for visiting brothels in large groups, then refusing to pay or starting drunken riots. These were the supposed future theologians of Christendom, staggering through the streets with swords, brawling with innkeepers, and leaving angry graffiti. Sound familiar? Yes, medieval frat boys existed, and they were terrible tippers. Meanwhile, across the Alps, in Florence, brothels were practically a civic institution. The city regulated everything: prices, opening hours, even the outfits prostitutes could wear. In some places, they had to wear yellow so that everyone knew their profession, which was both stigmatizing and, let's be honest, kind of impractical. Nothing screams secret rendezvous like a bright yellow outfit announcing your occupation. But here's the twist. While women in brothels were controlled, taxed and shamed, elite men carried on with mistresses and affairs without much consequence. Popes had children, kings flaunted their lovers, and noble families arranged marriages that were basically financial contracts. Public morality was for the poor, private indulgence was for the rich, and sometimes it all blew up spectacularly. Take King Philip IV of France, nicknamed the Fair, handsome but utterly ruthless. In 1314, he accused his daughters-in-law of adultery after catching wind that they'd been entertaining knights in a Parisian tower. The women were imprisoned, their lovers executed, and the scandal rocked the royal family. The irony? Philip himself had mistresses, but as usual, the rules didn't apply to kings. Another royal who couldn't keep scandals out of the bedroom was Edward II of England. He openly favoured male companions, most famously Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, lavishing them with titles and wealth while neglecting his wife Isabella. The barons hated it. Isabella eventually turned against him, launched a rebellion, and long story short, Edward ended up deposed, humiliated, and very likely murdered. Whether or not the lurid details about a red-hot poker are true is debated, but the point is, his personal life was a political disaster. Meanwhile, ordinary townsfolk kept trudging to the stews, the taverns, and the yellow-clad women because life was short, disease was rampant, and cheap ale made everything easier. Brothels were part of the urban landscape, tolerated, scorned, and indispensable all at once, and just like Pompeii, medieval Europe left us little windows into that world. Legal documents, sermons, court cases, complaints about noise, about men sneaking in after curfew, about women throwing chamber pots out the window. History is rarely about marble statues. It's usually about somebody yelling at their neighbors for keeping the brothel open too late. So what was it like to visit a brothel in medieval Europe? Less frescoes, more ale, less stone beds, more straw piles, a little cheaper than a decent chicken dinner, and about as sanitary. And hovering over it all, the constant hum of hypocrisy, priests preaching against sin while landlords pocketed the rent. All right. Let's drift again. In the next stretch, we'll float into the Renaissance and early modern world, where brothels got a little fancier, courtesans became celebrities, and kings started pouring national budgets into mistresses. Because if there's one thing history proves, it's that powerful men never met a bad idea they didn't double down on. Renaissance courtesans and royal mistresses. Hey guys. So we've shuffled out of the noisy medieval stews, brushed off the smell of ale, and now we're stepping into the Renaissance. Everything looks fancier. There are velvet gowns, perfumed gloves, lute music drifting through the courtyards. And the business of brothels? Oh, it's still here, but it's gotten an upgrade. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was shifting. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Rome weren't just political hubs. They were centers of art, banking, and scandal. And with all that money sloshing around, prostitution also climbed a new social ladder. This is when the figure of the courtesan enters the stage. Now, what's the difference between a brothel worker and a courtesan? Mostly branding. Brothel workers were still packed into noisy houses, charging a few coins for quick visits. Courtesans, meanwhile, catered to wealthy men. They weren't just about sex. They offered witty conversation, music, poetry, and the illusion of refined companionship. Think of them as the Renaissance's influencers, except instead of Instagram captions, they had sonnets dedicated to them. Venice, in particular, was famous for its courtesans. The city was basically one big floating carnival, full of masked balls, gambling halls, and candlelit gondola rides. And because Venice was a republic run by wealthy merchants, courtesans found a niche. They dressed in silks, studied languages, and entertained powerful visitors. A high-ranking courtesan could live almost like a noblewoman, except her status depended on charm and patronage, not bloodlines. One of the most famous was Veronica Franco. She was a Venetian courtesan and poet in the 16th century who not only entertained clients but published poetry collections, and not the prudish kind either. She wrote openly about love, desire, and the double standards women faced. She even exchanged verses with men like the painter Tintoretto. At one point, she was accused of witchcraft, because of course she was, but managed to survive with her wit and connections. Compared to the anonymous lives of brothel women, her fame was remarkable. And yet, let's not romanticize it too much. For every Veronica Franco, there were hundreds of women trapped in the lower end of the trade. Venetian authorities actually ran a kind of double system, flashy courtesans for the elite and municipal brothels for everyone else. They even forced prostitutes to wear yellow scarves or veils. Yes, the medieval habit continued, so you could spot them easily in the street. Subtle branding, Renaissance style. Rome had its own twist. During the papal court of the 16th century, courtesans were practically part of the city's economy. Pilgrims came to see the Pope, yes, but they also came for entertainment. Guides were even printed with lists of courtesans and their specialties. Imagine arriving in the Holy City, picking up your devotional pamphlets in one hand and your who's who of Roman courtesans in the other. Sacred and profane, side by side, just like always. But if Venice gave us courtesans, France gave us royal mistresses. And oh, did the French monarchy love a mistress. Starting in the late Middle Ages, but really peaking in the Renaissance, kings of France turned their mistresses into full-on celebrities. They weren't hidden in shame. They were given titles, estates, even political influence. Take Charles VII, for example. His mistress, Agnès Sorel, was so influential that courtiers called her the Lady of Beauty. She set fashion trends, walked around court in daring low-cut gowns, and reportedly gave Charles actual political advice. She died young, possibly from poisoning, but left a legacy as the first official royal mistress of France. Fast forward a century, and we get Francis I, who basically turned mistresses into state officials. He was known as the father and restorer of letters, which sounds noble, but he also spent lavishly on women at court. His love affairs were legendary, and he used them as political tools, forming alliances through women as much as through treaties. But the French king who really perfected the art of the mistress was Henry IV, nicknamed the Green Gallant. For his endless energy, romantically, not politically, he had dozens of mistresses and fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children. He was constantly juggling affairs, including with Gabrielle d'Estrées, who nearly became queen despite being already married. Henry even had coins struck with her image, which was basically the Renaissance version of putting your girlfriend on national postage stamps. Subtlety was not his thing, and hovering above all of this was the church, still wagging its finger in sermons while conveniently ignoring the reality at court. Popes were no better. Alexander VI, better known as Rodrigo, Borgia, had multiple children by his mistress Vanozza de Catane and openly promoted his family's interests. The papal court during his reign was less holy fathers and more family business. If you were a Renaissance cardinal, you might spend your day alternating between mass and masked banquets with courtesans. Because balance. Now, one thing that really changed in the Renaissance was how visible these women became in culture. Courtesans appeared in paintings, poetry, plays. Mistresses became household names. While earlier ages had treated prostitutes as necessary shadows, the Renaissance turned some of them into icons. Of course, their fame was fragile and dependent on powerful men, but it's still striking. Meanwhile, at the lower end, brothels continued to hum. They were licensed, regulated, taxed. Some cities even set up official red light districts away from churches and schools, which, to be fair, is a step up from carving stone penises into the road. But the stigma never disappeared. Respectable women were told to avoid them. Respectable men were told to repent afterward. And yet everyone knew they were central to urban life. And because humans are endlessly hypocritical, moralists kept writing pamphlets about how awful brothels were, while secretly frequenting them. One satirical poem from 16th century England even complains that prostitutes grow rich while honest men grow poor, which tells you less about economics and more about one man's personal grudges. So what was it like to visit a brothel, or rather to visit a courtesan, in Renaissance Europe? You'd expect music, conversation, fashion, maybe even a bit of poetry before anything else. A night that blurred the line between salon and bedroom. For the wealthy, it was almost a performance, complete with cultural sophistication. For everyone, else it was still the same old smoky taverns, straw bedding and municipal taxes, two worlds existing side by side, and of course, kings and nobles set the tone. If the ruler was parading mistresses in silk, the local tavern keeper saw no reason not to keep his backroom busy. Culture trickled down, even in matters of vice. All right, let's let the lute music fade out and drift once more. Because if the Renaissance gave us glamorous courtesans and mistresses, the early modern age, the 17th and 18th centuries, cranked things up even higher. Versailles, powdered wigs, and entire palaces full of royal favorites. It's going to get lavish, it's going to get ridiculous, and it's going to be very, very French. Versailles and the age of extravagant mistresses. Hey guys. So, the Renaissance gave us courtesans who quoted poetry and kings who paraded their girlfriends like state trophies. But the 17th and 18th centuries, they went full theatre. Versailles became not just a palace, but a stage. And on that stage, royal mistresses weren't side characters. They were practically co-stars. Let's start with Louis XIV, the Sun King. He reigned so long that France basically forgot what life before him looked like. And as much as he loved building Versailles and micromanaging court etiquette, Louis also loved women. He had a wife, of course, Maria Theresa of Spain, but she spent most of her life politely ignored. The real drama swirled around his mistresses. Early on, he favored Louise de la Vallière, a quiet, shy woman who actually seemed to love him sincerely, which of course made her completely unfit for the competitive shark tank of Versailles. She eventually retired to a convent, leaving the field open to Madame de Montespan. Now, Madame de Montespan was the real star. She was witty, dazzling, and ruthless. She bore Louis several children, who were all later legitimized, because when you're the king, you can just invent new branches of royalty whenever you feel like it. Montespan became so dominant at court that even the queen had to defer to her. Imagine sitting through dinner while your husband's mistress runs the conversation. That was Maria Theresa's life, nightly. But Montespan's reign ended in scandal. She got tangled in the infamous affair of the poisons, a messy court case where fortune-tellers, poisoners, and black magic practitioners were accused of selling charms and deadly powders to desperate nobles. Montespan's name came up in testimony, with whispers of love potions and even black masses performed to secure the king's affection. Louis eventually distanced himself, though he never quite abandoned her. Still, the damage was done. Enter Madame de Maintenon. She was pious, reserved, and a complete contrast to Montespan's flamboyance. She started as the governess of Louis's illegitimate children and somehow ended up as his secret wife in later life. Yes, the Sun King, builder of Versailles, married his former governess in a private ceremony. It wasn't official in terms of state, but she became his companion for the last decades of his reign. A mistress turned almost queen. Versailles loved a plot twist. Now, Louis XIV set the pattern, but Louis XV turned mistress culture into an art form. His most famous lover, Madame de Pompadour. She wasn't just a mistress, she was basically France's cultural minister. She commissioned art, supported philosophers, and even had a hand in state decisions. Voltaire adored her, artists painted her endlessly, and she turned Versailles into a hub of Enlightenment sparkle. Pompadour was also pragmatic. When her relationship with Louis cooled physically, she reinvented herself as his best friend and, en confidante, staying in power for decades. She even reportedly arranged other women for him because Versailles was nothing if not surreal. Imagine being so secure in your role that you outsource the actual mistress duties but keep the title. That was Pompadour. After her came Madame du Barry, who represented the other end of the spectrum. She wasn't noble or cultured. She came from humble beginnings, rising through the demi-monde of Paris. But she caught Louis XV's eye, and suddenly she was parading in diamonds at Versailles. Nobles sneered, but the king adored her, until, of course, the revolution came. Du Barry was eventually executed by guillotine, the crowd jeering at the symbol she'd become of royal decadence. And that revolution didn't come out of nowhere. By the late 18th century, the French monarchy had become synonymous with excess. Versailles glittered, but the streets of Paris starved. The public read endless pamphlets about the king's mistresses, mocking their luxury while bread prices soared. The connection between royal bedrooms and political collapse was in many ways direct. Speaking of which, let's drift to poor Marie Antoinette. Now, technically, she wasn't a mistress, she was the queen. But the rumor mill at Versailles was so vicious that pamphlets constantly accused her of every possible scandal. Affairs with courtiers, affairs with women, secret orgies, you name it. She was painted as a new Madame du Barry, except without the king's affection to protect her. The irony? Marie Antoinette's marriage with Louis XVI was famously awkward and unconsummated for years. But facts never mattered in scandal politics. Across the Channel, England was no less dramatic. Charles II, the Merry Monarch, basically ran his court like a permanent party. His mistresses included actresses like Nell Gwyn, who became beloved by the public for her humor and lack of pretense. She once famously referred to herself as the Protestant whore, poking fun at her Catholic rivals. And the English people actually liked her for it. If you're going to be a royal mistress, self-deprecating wit was apparently the key to public approval. Charles fathered a dozen illegitimate children, scattering new dukes across England like party favors. His poor wife, Catherine of Braganza, remained childless and humiliated. But Charles never let that stop him. He even joked on his deathbed, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying," which is very on brand for a man who lived like a permanent tavern song. Other English kings weren't quite as charming. George I and George II both had mistresses installed at court, but they lacked Charles's easy charisma. Instead, their favorites were resented as greedy foreigners, hoarding influence. By the 18th century, the public mood was turning. The idea of mistresses as glamorous ornaments gave way to the idea of them as parasites, which, given the financial crises, wasn't entirely wrong. But Versailles remained the true theatre of mistresses. No other court staged the drama so completely. Women like Montespan, Maintenon, Pompadour, and Du Barry weren't just lovers. They were political players, cultural patrons, and scapegoats all at once. Versailles was built to dazzle, and the mistresses were part of the dazzle, glittering jewels covering the cracks in the monarchy until the whole building fell down. So what was it like to visit a brothel in Versailles? Well, you didn't. Versailles was its own brothel. The entire palace functioned as a gilded stage for sex, politics, and hypocrisy. The king's bedroom was literally the center of the building, and court life revolved, sometimes literally, around who got invited inside. Power, pleasure, and performance, all under chandeliers that cost more than entire villages. All right, let's let Versailles fade into candlelight for now. In the next part, we'll drift into the 19th century, when industrial cities, moral reformers, and Victorian hypocrisy reshaped the story again. Brothels didn't disappear. They just put on corsets and gas lamps, moving into the modern age. Victorian brothels, hypocrisy, and scandal, hey guys. So, Versailles has faded away, the wigs have deflated, and suddenly we're in the 19th century. Steam engines chug, factories roar, and moralists are handing out pamphlets on every corner. It's the age of the Victorians, or as I like to call it, the golden age of saying one thing while doing the exact opposite. Let's start with London, because London really leaned into this contradiction. By the mid-1800s, the city had thousands of brothels. Estimates range from 5,000 to over 8,000. That's a whole neighborhood's worth of discreet entertainment. And yet, if you picked up a newspaper or listened to a preacher, you'd think London was the capital of virtue. Publicly, everyone wrung their hands about the fallen women. Privately, brothels flourished like corner pubs. Some were dingy, of course. Little more than overcrowded boarding houses where desperate women earned a few pennies. But others were surprisingly elegant. The upper-class establishments, often run by savvy madams, featured velvet curtains, good wine, and parlour games. They advertised themselves almost as gentlemen's clubs with extra benefits. Think less straw mattresses, more mahogany furniture. Still exploitative, of course, but dressed up in nicer upholstery. One of the most famous madams of Victorian London was Charlotte Hayes, nicknamed Mother Hayes. She ran brothels so upscale that noblemen and even politicians dropped by. She was known for throwing elaborate masquerade parties, where clients could indulge in their favorite fantasies behind masks and candlelight. And when newspapers pretended not to know such things happened, everyone still knew. At the other end of the spectrum, there was Covent Garden's low trade. Streetwalkers crowded dark alleys, often no older than teenagers, many of them impoverished or addicted to gin. The contrast between velvet-draped salons and damp cobblestones was sharp and very Victorian. Now, Victorian hypocrisy reached its peak with the Contagious Diseases Acts. Passed in the 1860s, these laws aimed to control venereal disease in the army and navy. But how did they do that? By targeting women, of course. Prostitutes could be stopped on the street, forcibly examined by doctors, and detained in lock hospitals. Men, the clients, faced no consequences. Women carried the stigma. Men carried their business as usual. This sparked a public backlash, led by Josephine Butler, a feminist campaigner who bravely spoke out against the humiliation these laws inflicted. She and her allies fought for decades, and the acts were finally repealed in the 1880s. But the entire episode shows just how skewed Victorian morality really was. Punish the powerless, protect the privileged. A tale as old as time. Speaking of privilege, let's drift to the royal family. Because even while the Victorians preached virtue, the royals had their own share of scandal. King Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria, was notorious for his mistresses. Nicknamed Dirty Bertie, he was a regular at Parisian brothels and even had a custom-built love chair designed to accommodate his royal weight during encounters. Yes, the chair still exists, on display in a Paris museum. Sleep tight with that image. Edward's tastes weren't a secret. He befriended courtesans like La Belle Otero and Lily Langtry, actresses who blurred the line between performer and royal mistress. Society gossiped, but ultimately shrugged, because that's what kings did. Meanwhile, newspapers printed endless articles about working-class immorality, conveniently ignoring the Prince of Wales's escapades. The Victorians also gave us the grand tour of brothels. Wealthy young men, sent off to Europe to polish their education, often polished other things instead. Paris, in particular, became famous for its maison closes, lavish, state-regulated brothels with ornate decor, champagne fountains, and carefully curated women. The French even published guides, complete with reviews and rankings. Picture a Michelin guide, but for brothels. Tourists from England gobbled it up. Publicly, they condemned French immorality. Privately, they took notes. One of the most infamous Parisian houses was Le Chabanais, which catered to kings, princes, and celebrities. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia visited. So did the future Edward VII. The decor included themed rooms, Japanese, Moorish, Louis XVI, so you could indulge in both historical and geographical fantasies. Again, nothing subtle about this, but back in London, the scandal that really stuck in the public imagination was the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888. Now, don't worry, we won't dwell on gore. But it's worth noting that the victims were poor women working as prostitutes in Whitechapel. Their murders exposed the brutal vulnerability of sex workers in the city, living in poverty and ignored by society until their deaths became a public spectacle. The case filled newspapers with lurid stories, but few people cared about the systemic problems behind it. Victorian morality loved a horror story, but not a real solution. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America had its own brothel boom. Cities, like New Orleans, San Francisco, and New York, were full of parlor houses and cribs. Storyville, the red light district of New Orleans, became famous for jazz, champagne, and long nights. Some madams, like Lulu White, became celebrities in their own right, strutting around in diamonds and running houses that doubled as music halls. But whether in London, Paris, or New Orleans, the story was the same. Society condemned sex work, loudly in theory, but indulged in it endlessly in practice. Reformers lectured, lawmakers punished, and yet business boomed. Brothels adapted, evolved, and kept the doors open under gaslight and velvet curtains. So what was it like to visit a brothel in the Victorian era? Honestly, it depended on your wallet. If you were wealthy, it was velvet, champagne, witty banter, and maybe a discreet note in a French guidebook. If you were poor, it was gin-soaked alleys, damp sheets, and a constant risk of disease or police harassment. Either way, the experience lived under a cloud of public shame, even as demand never wavered. And once again, we see the same pattern. Stretching from Pompeii to Paris, power protects the clients, stigma falls on the women, and everyone pretends society is more virtuous than it really is. History doesn't change as much as we'd like to think. All right, let's leave the foggy gaslit streets here. In the next part, we'll drift into the 20th century, where wars, jazz clubs, and new moral panics reshaped the story yet again. Brothels didn't vanish. They just got neon signs, flapper girls, and a brand new set of scandals. 20th century brothels, jazz, and warhay guys. So, the Victorians left us with a strange inheritance. Public morals tied in tight corsets, and private behavior that kept slipping out at night. When the calendar turned to the 1900s, the corsets started loosening. Brothels didn't just survive the century, they reinvented themselves. Let's start with Paris, again. Because Paris never really let go of its brothel culture. In the early 20th century, the French government officially licensed maisons closes, brothels, under a strict regulatory system. That meant the women were medically inspected, registered, and monitored. The houses were legal, visible, and surprisingly stylish. Some were modest little establishments, but others became landmarks. The most famous, Le Chabanais, still thriving. From the 19th century, It hosted everyone from Edward VII of England to Toulouse-Lautrec. Its themed rooms, like the Japanese salon, became almost tourist attractions. The line between brothel and nightclub blurred. You went not just for sex, but for music, conversation, and the heady Parisian atmosphere. And then there was the jazz. After World War I, African-American musicians brought jazz to Paris, and brothels quickly adopted it. Picture dim rooms, cigarette, smoke curling upward, and a saxophone drifting through the haze. Brothels doubled as jazz clubs, where musicians found steady work and soldiers found a familiar sound. Paris became the capital of jazz in Europe, and brothels were part of that scene. Meanwhile, in America, the story was less glamorous. The early 20th century saw a massive moral panic about prostitution. Reformers launched campaigns about white slavery, warning that innocent young women were being lured into vice by shady men. Some of it was exaggerated moral propaganda, but it led to the Mann Act of 1910, which criminalized transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. In practice, the law was vague and often abused. Jack Johnson, the black heavyweight boxing champion, was famously targeted under it, simply for traveling with his white girlfriends. Despite the panic, brothels thrived in American cities. New Orleans had Storyville, a legally designated red light district set up in 1897. It was famous for music, champagne, and women. Storyville became a training ground for early jazz legends like Jelly Roll Morton and Louis Armstrong. By day, music floated from the parlor houses. By night, soldiers and sailors poured in, wallets in hand. But World War I changed everything. The US military, worried about venereal disease, pressured governments to shut down brothels near army camps. Storyville was closed in 1917, officially ending its era. But of course, prostitution didn't end. It just moved underground. The same story, different decade. Let's drift into the interwar years. The 1920s roared and brothels adapted. Flapper culture, short skirts, bobbed hair, it all filtered into sex work. Brothels decorated themselves like speakeasies, with jazz bands, cocktails, and Art Deco furniture. The boundaries between nightclub, cabaret, and brothel blurred almost completely. In Berlin, during the Weimar Republic, entire neighborhoods turned into nightlife zones, filled with cabarets, drag shows, and brothels catering to every taste imaginable. Berlin became notorious for its openness. Travelers from conservative countries wrote home in shock or delight. Of course, then the 1930s hit, and things darkened again. The Great Depression meant poverty, desperation, and survival sex work. Brothels became less glamorous, more desperate. In the US, some madams still maintained discreet houses for wealthier clients, but most women worked on the streets or in cribs, tiny rented rooms, often unsafe and unsanitary. The contrast between the glitter of the 1920s and the bleakness of the 1930s was sharp. And then came World War II. Soldiers and brothels are an old story, and the 1940s were no exception. Both Allied and Axis armies worried constantly about venereal disease. Some armies officially set up comfort stations or regulated brothels for troops. The most infamous were Japan's Comfort Women system, which forced tens of thousands of women into military brothels across Asia. It remains one of the darkest chapters of 20th century sexual history. In Europe, occupied cities saw German military brothels established, often using coerced women. Meanwhile, American and British soldiers flooded local black markets, paying for sex wherever they could. Brothels became part of the war economy, tolerated, if not officially endorsed. After the war, the cultural mood shifted again. The 1950s saw a wave of conservatism. Brothels were increasingly shut down or pushed further underground. Paris closed its maisons closes in 1946, ending the licensed system. New laws emphasized rehabilitation of women and harsher punishments for pimps. Hey guys, tonight we're settling in with a quiet little stroll through Tudor England. So, if you've got a cup of tea nearby, or maybe a suspicious-looking glass of red wine that you swear was not smuggled from the king's cellar, you're in the right place. This is going to be one of those long, winding stories. Nothing too loud, nothing too dramatic. Just the kind of thing you can put on while you're falling asleep. Because really, the Tudors themselves were chaotic enough. They don't need us getting worked up about it too. Now, most people know Tudor England for the headline acts, Henry VIII and his unfortunate wives, Elizabeth I and her lonely devotion to duty, Mary Queen of Scots playing her tragic role. But, tucked in the corners of all this theatre, behind the banners and the portraits, were the women who didn't make it into the official textbooks. The mistresses, the favourites, the women whose names were sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, and sometimes just carefully erased. And it's their lives, half glamorous, half pitiful, that we're drifting through tonight. So let's start with the obvious, Henry VIII, because of course we are. You can't talk about Tudor mistresses without eventually getting dragged into his orbit. He was the sun, and everyone else, from his 6 wives to his illegitimate children, were planets wobbling around him in slightly unstable rotations. Now, here's the funny thing. Henry wasn't actually known for having that many mistresses compared to, say, his French rivals. Francis V, now there was a man who practically needed a revolving door installed in his bedchamber. But Henry, he liked to pretend he was a model of Christian virtue, which would be charming if we didn't know he was also busy dissolving monasteries and occasionally dissolving wives. But in the earlier years, before his waistline expanded into what could generously be described as a royal cushion, Henry did enjoy a few side adventures. One of the earliest names we get is Elizabeth Blount. Now, Elizabeth Blount, or Bessie as she was called, was one of those young ladies in waiting who got promoted by, shall we say, personal merit. She was described as being fair of face and body, which is Tudor speak for pretty enough to get noticed. She started serving Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, which, let's just pause and appreciate the awkwardness of flirting with your boss's husband while also handing her prayer books. But Henry noticed her, because of course he did. And unlike many mistresses who stayed in the shadows, Bessie's relationship with Henry left behind a rather permanent souvenir. Henry Fitzroy, the king's illegitimate son. Now, normally illegitimate children in royal families were like unacknowledged software updates. Everyone knew they existed, but officially you pretended they didn't. But Henry liked Fitzroy, enough to give him titles, enough to parade him around as a possible heir. And people actually worried that Henry might try to make Fitzroy king, because his legitimate line was already starting to look shaky. Of course, Fitzroy didn't live long enough to make that a real issue. The poor kid died at 17, probably, of tuberculosis, which was basically the default Tudor way of exiting stage left. But his very existence made Bessie Blount unusual. She wasn't just a fling. She was the mother of the boy who might have been king. And what happened to her after all this? She got married off to a respectable gentleman, because that's what you did with used-up mistresses. Pack them away with some land, a husband, and maybe a couple of sheep. It wasn't glamorous, but at least she got out alive and without a trip to the Tower, which is more than Catherine Howard could say. Now, speaking of Howard women, we can't forget Mary Boleyn. Yes, that Boleyn, the sister of Anne, future queen, future beheaded wife number 2. Mary is one of those people who somehow manages to always be a footnote in other people's lives. She was probably Henry's mistress in the 1520s, though the records are fuzzy, and Henry, in his typical fashion, never confirmed it. But she certainly had the reputation. Francis I of France even called her his English mare, which is Not exactly a compliment, but hey, it was the Renaissance. Men weren't big on subtlety. Mary's biggest contribution to history was possibly being the practice run before Henry moved on to her sister. And let's be real, that had to be the most awkward family dynamic of the Tudor age. Imagine your sister becoming queen because your ex decided he liked her better. Thanksgiving dinner would be unbearable. Mary eventually married beneath her station, which horrified her family. She chose love over politics, and the Boleyns promptly disowned her. So she spent the rest of her life quietly in the countryside, raising her kids and staying very far away from the axe that eventually came for Anne. Sometimes obscurity is the better option. But if you think Henry's mistresses had it tough, let's float over for a moment to Edward IV, Henry's grandfather-in-law. Because he set the tone for the whole dynasty when it came to mistresses, Edward was, well, how do I put this? A ladies' man in the most exhausting way possible. He was tall, handsome, and apparently irresistible, which sounds nice until you realize his idea of romance was quantity over quality. Chroniclers actually complained that his affairs were distracting him from governing. Imagine being so distracted by flirting that your kingdom starts to collapse. Classic Plantagenet energy. One of his most famous mistresses was Elizabeth Shaw, often just called Jane Shaw. She was witty, pretty, and actually managed to stay popular even after Edward died, which was a real achievement, considering Richard III came along and started purging anyone with a pulse. Jane Shaw ended up being dragged barefoot through London as a punishment for her scandalous life, but honestly, she probably had a better time than half the actual queens of England. Now back to the Tudors, because Henry VIII wasn't the only one dabbling in this hobby. His daughter Elizabeth I famously avoided marriage, but she had her favourites. The most obvious name. Here is Robert Dudley. Elizabeth and Dudley's relationship has been debated for centuries, with historians carefully circling the question of whether they were lovers. But let's be real. Elizabeth spent half her life clinging to Dudley like a security blanket. He was handsome, ambitious, and conveniently available after his wife, Amy Robsart, died in what was either a tragic accident or the clumsiest setup in history. Elizabeth never married him, of course, because that would have been too simple. Instead, she dangled him around court for decades, driving foreign ambassadors insane with speculation. Poor Amy was left as the cautionary tale, forever remembered for tumbling down the stairs. And if Dudley wasn't enough, Elizabeth kept a rotating cast of favourites. Walter Raleigh, Christopher Hatton, the Earl of Essex. Basically, her court was like a Tudor version of The Bachelorette. Except the prize was absolutely not marriage. But let's soften things again, because not all mistresses ended up tragic. Some of them carved out weird little niches for themselves. For example, Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk. She wasn't exactly a mistress, but she was widowed young, and there were rumours Henry VIII considered making her wife number 7, which honestly would have been impressive, like collecting the whole set. But Catherine dodged that bullet, and instead became known for her sharp tongue and Protestant zeal. She once joked about Henry's ulcerated leg, which, brave move, very brave. So, as we drift here through Tudor England, you can see a pattern. Mistresses were both powerful and powerless. They could give birth to potential heirs, influence politics, and sometimes even nudge history in a different direction. But they were also disposable, easy to cast aside, easy to blame. Some were remembered only because of their famous lovers. Others, like Bessie Blount, left behind children who could have changed everything if they had lived longer or if Henry had been a little more reckless. And the irony is, the Tudors weren't even the most scandalous dynasty. Compared to the French Valois or the Medici in Italy, the Tudors were practically conservative. But in England, where everything was supposed to look proper on the surface, Mistresses became a kind of open secret. Everyone knew, but no one said too much. All right. That's enough wondering for now. We've only just set the stage, and already we've got illegitimate princes, disowned daughters, and a parade of unfortunate women who probably should have just taken up embroidery instead. Next time, we'll float deeper into this world, looking at more forgotten names, the side romances of Henry's children, and how mistresses kept shaping England even when they weren't supposed to. But for now, rest easy, because the Tudors will always be there in the background, plotting, flirting, and quietly ruining their family trees. Jane Poppincourt and other courtly detours. So, let's slide back into Tudor England. Candles still flickering, tapestries still dusty, and the court still buzzing with whispers about who's dancing with who. Tonight we pick up with one of the more forgotten names, Jane Poppincourt. Now, Jane isn't exactly a household name. You're not going to find her staring moodily from a Holbein portrait. She was a Frenchwoman, brought to England to help instruct Henry VII's daughters in the ways of French manners, which, if we're honest, basically meant teaching them how to smile politely while everyone tried to marry them off like chess pieces. But Jane was clever and attractive, and Henry VIII, when he was still young and not yet shaped like a wine barrel, took a liking to her. Of course he did. She was foreign, a little exotic by English standards, and she knew how to flirt in French, which was always a shortcut to Tudor hearts. The records of her arrangement with Henry are deliberately vague. Polite chroniclers in Tudor times like to tiptoe around the word mistress unless absolutely necessary. But she lingered at court suspiciously long, popping up in lists of attendants and festivities. She was even rumoured to have entangled herself with the Duke of Suffolk, Charles Brandon. And really, if you were trying to collect Tudor bad boys, Brandon was a solid choice. But in the end, Jane didn't climb high. She left court in relative obscurity, slipping back to France, which is kind of the theme here. For every Mary Boleyn who left a big ripple, there were half a dozen Janes who passed through the court like faint perfume. Present for a while, then gone. Now, another name we need to mention is Lady Elizabeth Carew. She's one of those figures who straddled the line between gossip and actual history. Elizabeth was married to Sir Nicholas Carew, a man close to Henry VIII, but rumour, and let's be clear, Tudor rumour was a sport in itself, suggested that Elizabeth and Henry had a bit of a thing. This was never officially confirmed. Of course, what king is going to sign paperwork admitting to his side hobbies? But poets of the time seemed to hint at it, and Henry was generous with gifts to her family, which in Tudor language usually meant, "Thanks for looking the other way while I visit your wife." The funny part, Elizabeth's husband stayed loyal to Henry until the very end, even when Nicholas Carew eventually got executed for supposedly backing the wrong side of a rebellion, which, let's be honest, was practically a rite of passage at Tudor court. His wife never officially fell from grace, which suggests Henry valued her enough not to ruin her, or maybe by that point he'd forgotten her name. With Henry, both are equally possible. And then there's Anne Hastings. She's a good reminder that mistresses weren't always volunteers. Anne was married to Lord Hastings, but at some point, young Henry VIII, fresh, cocky, newly on the throne, set his sights on her. The story goes that Henry pursued her aggressively, to the point where her husband reportedly grew anxious about keeping his honor intact. Which was fair, because Henry wasn't exactly subtle. The king wanted what he wanted, and if that meant someone else's wife, well, that was the perk of being king. Anne didn't leave much trace after this episode, which is probably for the best. Women in her position often had to smile, endure, and hope their husbands didn't start sharpening daggers. And while we're here, let's pause on the broader theme. The lives of mistresses in Tudor England were basically a lottery. Some struck gold. They got lands, marriages and pensions that set them up for life. Others got discarded the minute the king found a new distraction, and almost none of them had a say in whether they were pulled into the royal orbit to begin. With this wasn't a modern romantic choice. It was politics, status, sometimes survival. Imagine being a 17-year-old girl, dressed up for a mask, and suddenly the king notices you. That's not a fairy tale. That's a career hazard. Now let's float away from Henry for a moment, because as much as he dominates this subject, other Tudors dabbled too. Take Mary Tudor, Henry's younger sister, not to be confused with his daughter Mary, who grew up to burn Protestants for fun. This Mary married King Louis XV of France in what was basically a diplomatic transaction. The problem? Louis was in his 50s, creaky, and not exactly built for longevity. Within a few months, he was dead. Mary, still young and now widowed, took matters into her own hands. She secretly married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Yes, the same Brandon who occasionally flirted with Jane Poppincourt. Brandon was Henry VIII's best friend, which made this secret marriage both reckless and hilarious. Henry was furious when he found out, but eventually forgave them, mostly because Brandon was too useful to stay mad at for long. Now, technically, Mary wasn't a mistress in the English sense. She was a wife, twice in fact, but her whirlwind remarriage to Brandon was so scandalous it might as well have been an affair. And it shows how the Tudor women sometimes flipped the script, choosing love or lust over dynastic duty, not often, but sometimes. And then there's the quiet, shadowy existence of mistresses during the reign of Edward VI, which is to say, there weren't any. Edward was a teenager, a serious little Protestant boy, and he died before he had much of a personal life at all. If he had lived, maybe he'd have picked up the family hobby. But as it stands, Edward's reign is the one Tudor moment blissfully free of bedroom drama, which brings us right back to the chaos with Mary Y and Elizabeth. Mary Y, Bloody Mary, was devoted to her husband, Philip of Spain. And while she didn't have mistresses in the same sense, her marriage was its own tragic comedy. Philip found her dull, unattractive, and inconveniently in love with him. He spent as little time in England as possible, and Mary spent the rest of her short reign pining for children she never had. So no colourful affairs here, just a lot of quiet heartbreak. Elizabeth, as we mentioned, avoided marriage altogether, but made up for it with her favourites. Robert Dudley, Walter Raleigh, the Earl of Essex, all men who basked in her attention, all whispered about as possible lovers. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. Elizabeth was too careful to let herself be pinned down. Her virginity became political propaganda, and she wasn't about to throw it away for a flirtation. But the rumours kept her court lively, and for the mistresses and wives of those favourites, it must have been excruciating. Imagine knowing your husband was dancing attendance on the Queen every night, and there was nothing you could do about it. And this is where we can slowly drift into the Stuarts, because if the Tudors had complicated mistress culture, the Stuarts went ahead and made it a full-time profession. But before we get there, one last Tudor footnote. A reminder that mistresses weren't always villains or schemers or tragic victims. Sometimes they were just women navigating a dangerous, glittering, exhausting world. And if they played it right, they survived. If they played it wrong, they ended up a poem, a rumour, or a bare mention in a dusty chronicle. Jane Poppincourt, Elizabeth Carew, Anne Hastings. They're not famous, but they remind us that behind every coronation, every alliance, every execution, there were women living half-lives in the margins. Charles II and the Stuart mistress industry. So, let's float out of the Tudors now. The candles, gutter, the old oak-panelled halls of Henry's court fade behind us, and we step quietly into the Stuart world. The tone changes. The wigs are bigger, the dresses wider, the perfume stronger. And suddenly, mistresses aren't just whispered about, they're paraded in front of everyone, painted on canvases, given titles, and sometimes allowed to boss around actual ministers. Welcome to the Restoration. The year is 1660, and England has just had enough of being serious. Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan government tried to shut down theatres, ban Christmas, and make everyone behave like gloomy monks, which, as you can imagine, went down about as well as replacing pubs with water fountains. So when Charles II came back to claim his throne, he decided to swing the pendulum the other way. Instead of restraint, he gave England excess. And leading the charge in this new lifestyle, his mistresses. Now, Charles II had many, too many. Honestly, trying to count them is like trying to count grains of sand on Brighton Beach. But a few stood out. The first big name was Barbara Villiers, later Lady Castlemaine. Barbara was, let's say, impossible to ignore. She was tall, voluptuous, dramatic, and she had a temper that could peel paint, which is probably why Charles adored her. Barbara was married, of course, almost all of these women were, but that didn't slow her down. She became Charles's official mistress. Yes, official, to the point where courtiers had to treat her with the same deference as if she were an actual royal. She used her position shamelessly, demanding titles, lands, and favors for her relatives. At one point, she actually turned up at court heavily pregnant, loudly insisting the baby was the king's, just to force him to acknowledge it. Subtlety was not her strong point. Barbara gave Charles several children, many of whom he acknowledged and provided for, which is another Charles II quirk. He loved his illegitimate kids. He recognized more than a dozen of them, handing out dukedoms, like party favors. In fact, many modern British aristocrats trace their lineage back to those illegitimate lines. Barbara's descendants alone include the Dukes of Grafton and the Earls of Jersey. Not bad for a woman who started as a court beauty, but Barbara wasn't. Universally adored. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, often wrote about her with a mix of fascination and disgust. Even her allies admitted she was greedy and vindictive. Yet Charles kept her around for years. Maybe it was passion, maybe it was habit, or maybe Charles, who hated confrontation, just didn't know how to get rid of her. If Barbara was the stormy mistress, then Nell Gwyn was the sunshine. Nell came from nothing. She grew up in poverty, possibly selling oranges at the theatre before working her way onto the stage. She became an actress and comedian, not exactly a respectable profession at the time, but certainly a lively one, and Charles loved lively. Nell was witty, bawdy, and famously down-to-earth. While Barbara demanded jewels, Nell joked that she preferred honesty. She even quipped that she was the king's Protestant whore, a sly jab at the fact that Charles's other mistresses were mostly Catholic and therefore unpopular with the English public. Unlike Barbara, Nell wasn't power-hungry. She didn't try to meddle in politics. She just entertained Charles, made him laugh, and bore him 2 sons. One of them, Charles Beauclerk, was made Duke of St. Albans, and that line still exists today. So if you ever meet a Beauclerk, yes, they're descended from Nell Gwyn, the theatre girl who became England's sweetheart. Nell's charm was so enduring that when Charles was on his deathbed, he supposedly whispered to his brother James, "Let not poor Nellie starve." And James, to his credit, made sure she was provided for. For a mistress, that's practically a fairy tale ending. But Charles didn't stop there. Oh no. There was Louise de Kerouaille, a French Catholic sent by Louis XIV as a kind of diplomatic spy. Charles fell for her too, of course, and she became known as one of his most influential mistresses. Louise was elegant, refined, and very good at steering Charles toward French interests, which made her widely hated in England. People saw her as the scheming foreign temptress, the polar opposite of cheerful Nell. Satirists lampooned her, ballads mocked her accent, and yet she still managed to hold on to Charles for years. She bore him a son, Charles Lennox, who became Duke of Richmond. And yes, that line also still exists. So just to pause here, in case you're wondering why half the dukedoms in England trace back to Charles II, this is why. He didn't leave legitimate heirs. His poor wife Catherine of Braganza remained childless, but he more than made up for it in the illegitimate department. And then there was Moll Davis, another actress, and Lucy Walter, his earlier mistress who gave birth to James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, the ill-fated rebel who tried to claim the throne later, and countless others, some lasting only a season, others staying for years. Charles collected mistresses, the way some people collect stamps, and while this might sound glamorous, for the women it was a high-risk game. They could gain immense wealth and influence, but they could also be discarded overnight, left with nothing but scandal attached to their names. What makes Charles II's court so fascinating is how open it all was. Unlike the Tudors, where mistresses lurked in shadows, the Stuarts practically put them on parade. They sat in theatre boxes, flaunted diamonds, hosted salons. Everyone knew who they were, and poets even dedicated verses to them. This was partly Charles's personality. He was easygoing, indulgent, and didn't like to hide things, and partly the times. After the grim austerity of Cromwell, the Restoration was all about pleasure. If the Tudors were a dark Gothic painting, the Stuarts were a bright Baroque mural, dramatic, crowded, and full of people looking scandalous in silk. Now, you might think all this would cause political chaos. And you'd be right. Ministers constantly worried about the influence of royal mistresses. Barbara Villiers, in particular, was notorious for pushing her allies into positions of power. Louise de Querouaille basically acted as a French ambassador in Charles's bedchamber. Even Nell, who avoided politics, symbolized a more English faction of the court. So mistresses weren't just personal companions, they were political pawns, gifts from foreign powers, tools of propaganda, symbols of extravagance or of national pride, depending on the mood of the public. And of course, Charles II wasn't alone. Other Stuarts dabbled too. His brother, James II, had mistresses as well, though fewer than Charles. James was more serious, more rigid, and once he converted openly to Catholicism, his reputation in Protestant England went downhill fast. His mistresses, like Arabella Churchill, sister of the famous Duke of Marlborough, still bore him illegitimate children who became important in their own right. But James never made mistresses the centerpiece of his reign the way Charles did. And then there's Mary of Modena, James's second wife, who had to endure the whispers and eye rolls whenever her husband's lovers appeared. Mistresses weren't just inconveniences for queens, they were humiliations, living proof of where the king's real affections went. But we'll pause here with Charles II, because really, he is the poster child of the royal mistress system. His court turned it from a private indulgence into a public institution. And the legacies of his mistresses are still scattered across Britain today, in dukedoms, in estates, and in endless romanticized portraits. It's almost funny, in a sleepy sort of way. Charles II is remembered as the merry monarch, beloved for his charm and wit. Yet the women who made that merriment possible, the Barbaras, the Nells, the Louises, often ended up caricatured or forgotten. They were the background music of his reign, and yet without them, the Restoration would feel strangely empty. From late Stuarts to Hanoverian hostages, so we've floated through the merry chaos of Charles II. But as with all parties, the music eventually winds down. The late Stuarts were not nearly as flamboyant as Charles, but their mistresses still left plenty of traces. Take James II. Compared to his brother, James was almost dull. He was devout, stubborn, and had the charisma of a damp log. But that didn't He skipped the mistress tradition entirely. His most famous mistress was Arabella Churchill. Yes, that Churchill family. Arabella was the sister of John Churchill, who would become the Duke of Marlborough and one of England's greatest generals. So, being James's mistress actually worked out well for her family. Arabella wasn't considered particularly attractive. Samuel Pepys rather cruelly described her as plain, but apparently James saw something he liked. Or perhaps it was just convenience. Arabella bore James several children, including James Fitzjames, who would grow up to be the Duke of Berwick and an accomplished military commander. Unlike Charles II, James didn't parade his illegitimate children as much. He kept things quieter, more restrained. But the influence of Arabella's line lasted well beyond the Stuarts themselves. Now, when James was ousted in the Glorious Revolution and replaced by William and Mary, mistress culture took a temporary dip. William III wasn't known for flaunting affairs. He was too busy fighting wars, and frankly, he wasn't exactly a ladies' man. There were whispers about close male companions, but in terms of official mistresses, nothing flashy. Mary II, his wife, was deeply pious and long-suffering, and their reign had none of the theatrical romances of Charles's day. In fact, it was a little boring. Politically important, yes, but romantically, dry as toast. Then came Queen Anne. Now, Anne is interesting because she flipped the script entirely. She didn't have mistresses, she had favorites. Female favorites. The most notorious being Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Sarah wasn't Anne's lover in the sexual sense, at least as far as we can tell. But she dominated Anne emotionally. Letters between them are intense, full of passionate language, though it's best not to project too much modern meaning onto them. What matters is that Sarah wielded enormous power simply by being Anne's closest confidant. Eventually, of course, Sarah pushed too hard. She nagged Anne, bossed her around, and made herself insufferable. Anne replaced her with another favourite, Abigail Masham, who was gentler and less demanding. Sarah never forgave her, and spent the rest of her life writing bitter accounts of how unfair it all was. So, while not mistresses in the traditional sense, Anne's favourites filled the same role. They blurred the line between intimacy and politics, with the Queen's affections shaping court life and policy. And then, after Anne, the real shift happened. In 1714, the Stuarts were out and the Hanoverians were in. Enter George I. George I was, well, not exactly popular. He barely spoke English, preferred Germany, and treated England more like an inconvenient branch office than a home. And one of the first things people noticed about him, he came with mistresses in tow. The two most famous were Melusine von der Schulenburg and Sophia Charlotte von Kielmansegg. The English, never subtle, called them the Maypole and the Elephant, respectively. Melusine was tall and thin. Sophia was large and imposing. Court gossip loved to reduce them to these caricatures. Melusine was George's true companion, sticking with him for decades. She was granted titles and estates, and though the English sneered, she held her place, firmly. Sophia, meanwhile, was rumoured to be George's half-sister, though that didn't stop whispers about their closeness. It was all very awkward. For the English public, the sight of these foreign mistresses was infuriating. They represented everything people disliked about the new Hanoverian regime: German accents, foreign influence, and the sense that their king cared more about Hanover than England. Pamphlets mocked them, satirists skewered them, and yet George never wavered. He needed them. They were his comfort, his link to home, his companions in a country he didn't much like. Then came George II, who followed in his father's footsteps. He too had a long-term mistress, Henrietta Howard. Henrietta is one of the more sympathetic figures in this whole parade. She came to court as a lady-in-waiting, trapped in a miserable marriage to a drunken, abusive husband. becoming the king's mistress wasn't exactly a romantic choice. It was survival. It gave her protection, status, and eventually enough wealth to escape her marriage. What's striking is that Henrietta didn't really enjoy her role. She endured it. She was quiet, dignified, and resigned. And in the end, she managed to outlast it. Once her affair with George cooled, she retired peacefully to a villa in Twickenham, where she lived out her days, surrounded by poets and friends. Not a bad ending, considering the alternatives. George II's other mistress, Amélie von Walmoden, was less beloved. She came from Hanover, like so many of these women, and was seen as another example of foreign meddling, but George doted on her. Meanwhile, his wife, Queen Caroline, tolerated it all with remarkable patience. She knew that as long as she kept her influence in politics, she could put up with her husband's dalliances, which, honestly, was probably the smartest calculation of any queen in this saga. So by the time we reach the Hanoverians, mistresses have shifted from being glamorous courtesans, like in Charles II's day, to being almost semi-official fixtures. They were granted houses, titles, pensions. They became part of the machinery of monarchy. But the English people never warmed to them. For the public, mistresses were symbols of corruption, foreignness, and extravagance. They were constant fodder for satire, caricature, and angry pamphlets. If Charles II's mistresses had been loved like celebrities, the Hanoverian ones were more like the villains of the piece. And yet their lives still mattered. Melusine von der Schulenburg left behind properties and titles that wove into British aristocracy. Henrietta Howard became a respected hostess and patron of the arts. Even the scorned elephant left her mark in gossip and legend. It's ironic in a way. These women, mocked and derided in their own time, ended up shaping cultural memory, almost as much as the kings they loved. Faithful George, Fat Princes, and the Victorian reset. So we've passed through the German-accented mistresses of George I and II. Now we arrive at George III. And here's the twist. George III didn't really do mistresses. Yes, you heard that right. After centuries of monarchs parading lovers like peacocks, George III decided to go full domestic husband. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a young German princess, and, shockingly, he was faithful to her. Contemporaries were so stunned that they didn't quite know what to do with it. A king without mistresses, was that even legal? But George set himself up as a family man. He and Charlotte went on to have 15 children, which was less a family and more a small village. And while George would later suffer his well-known bouts of mental illness during his stable years, he seemed genuinely devoted to his queen. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors, but no serious evidence of mistresses has ever surfaced. For the royal gossip mill, it was disappointing. For Charlotte, it was probably exhausting enough just keeping track of all those kids. So, in George III's reign, the royal mistress tradition quietly stalled. And yet just wait, because his son, the future George IV, more than made up for it. Let's drift gently now to the reign of the Prince Regent, later George IV. If George III was the model of fidelity, George IV was not. He was flamboyant, gluttonous, perpetually in debt, and obsessed with pleasure. Picture a man who started life as a dashing prince and slowly expanded until he resembled a very well-upholstered sofa. That was George. His love life was chaotic from the start. He secretly and illegally married Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic. The marriage wasn't valid under English law, but George treated her like his true wife for years. She wasn't a mistress in the casual sense. She was more like his unofficial queen. Of course, he later abandoned her because consistency wasn't really his strong point. Enter a long string of mistresses, some glamorous, some scandalous, some both. George was the kind of man who fell in and out of love with dramatic flair. leaving behind piles of bills and broken promises. One of the most notorious of George IV's mistresses was Lady Hertford. She was witty, clever, and very aware of her power. While George doted on her, she maneuvered political allies into place and kept her family well supplied. She wasn't shy about it either. To some courtiers, Lady Hertford was basically the unofficial Prime Minister. Then came Lady Conyngham, who replaced her. Unlike Hertford, Lady Conyngham was less ambitious and more indulgent. She let George shower her with gifts, jewels, estates, you name it. By this time, George was bloated, sickly, and not particularly charming. But Lady Conyngham stayed by his side, perhaps more for the lifestyle than the man. The public, of course, loathed all of this. Pamphleteers and cartoonists skewered George as a greedy, self-indulgent fool. Caricatures showed him waddling through banquets, dripping in jewels, with mistresses dragging him deeper into debt. For a nation increasingly valuing Protestant work ethic and thrift, their king was a walking, eating, spending punchline. Meanwhile, George's official wife, Caroline of Brunswick, was living her own soap opera. Their marriage was a disaster. From day one, George found her repulsive, supposedly complaining about her smell and manners. Caroline, understandably, despised him right back. When George tried to divorce her, the scandal turned into national theatre. Caroline actually became more popular than her husband, simply because people disliked George that much. And his mistresses, inevitably, were dragged into the mess as symbols of his corruption. So here we see a shift. Mistresses were no longer glamorous figures like Nell Gwyn. By the Regency period, they were widely seen as parasites, symbols of waste, easy targets for public resentment. Now after George IV came William IV, who brought things back to a quieter, almost old-fashioned style. Before becoming king, William lived for 20 years with Dorothea Jordan, an Irish actress. Dorothea wasn't just a passing fling. She was his partner. Together they had 10 children, 10, all surnamed Fitzclarence. For 2 decades they lived as a family, though of course William never married her. She was officially his mistress, but functionally his common law wife. The tragedy is that when William became king, he abandoned her. Duty, image, politics, all conspired to push Dorothea aside. She ended her life in poverty, dying alone in France. Her children, however, were acknowledged and provided for, and some went on to have notable careers. William himself was a peculiar monarch, bluff, grumpy, a sailor at heart. After Dorothea, he didn't indulge much in mistresses as king. Perhaps he'd simply worn himself out, and then we arrive at Victoria. Victoria is where the tradition screeches to a halt. She reigned for most of the 19th century, and under her watch, the monarchy reinvented itself as the model of middle-class morality. Victoria adored her husband, Prince Albert. Their marriage was famously affectionate, producing 9 children, and a lifetime of sentimental letters. Unlike almost every monarch before her, Victoria had no mistresses or favorites in the romantic sense. Albert too was faithful, and after Albert's death, Victoria spent the rest of her life in mourning, dressing in black and clutching his memory like a relic. There were whispers about her closeness to John Brown, a Scottish servant, and later, Abdul Karim, an Indian attendant. But these weren't mistresses in the traditional sense. They were emotional companions, perhaps even substitute family, but never officially romantic. So under Victoria, the entire concept of the royal mistress went from public institution to historical relic. The monarchy needed to look respectable, middle class, moral. No more Nells or Barbaras parading through the palace, just dutiful queens, grieving widows, and carefully controlled public images. And that's how, by the 19th century, the mistress as a royal figure faded out of English history. The tradition that once shaped dynasties and sparked scandals became an embarrassment, something swept under the rug as Victorian values took over. It's a curious arc, really, from the quiet, half-hidden lovers of Henry VIII to the public celebrities of Charles II, to the foreign imports of the Hanoverians, and finally to the disappearance of mistresses altogether under Victoria. The quiet legacies of forgotten women. So here we are, near the end of our long stroll. We've drifted from the Tudors through the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, and finally into the strict Victorian order. By now, the palaces are quieter. The candlelight feels dimmer. The mistresses, once so bold and visible, have faded into the background of history. But before we close our eyes on them completely, let's take one more slow look at the bigger picture. Because the truth is, royal mistresses shaped history in ways that outlasted all the gossip, all the pamphlets, and all the petty court rivalries. Take the dynastic legacies. Henry VIII's acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, might have changed the entire succession if he'd lived longer. A boy born of a mistress could have replaced half of the bloody drama of the Tudor succession. We'll never know, but the possibility alone haunted the court. Charles II's mistresses created entire branches of the English aristocracy. The dukes of Grafton, Richmond, St. Albans and Buccleuch all descend from his illegitimate children. Walk through the House of Lords today, and you'll find peers whose bloodline traces not to queens, but to actresses and courtiers who once warmed the king's bed. Even the Hanoverians, mocked for dragging German companions across the Channel, left their imprint. Melusine von der Schulenburg's titles and estates lingered, while Henrietta Howard became a cultural patron remembered long after her royal connection cooled. Mistresses, in other words, planted roots, sometimes deeper than the official consorts, and then there's the cultural shadow. Nell Gwyn, the orange seller turned actress, still lives in English folklore as the cheerful Protestant whore. Plays, novels, even pubs still carry her name. Barbara Villiers, tempestuous and greedy, survives in caricature, the archetype of the demanding mistress. Henrietta Howard lives on as the dignified survivor, Dorothea Jordan as the tragic partner, abandoned when duty called. For women whose power was supposedly fleeting, they cast long shadows. It's a quiet irony. Queens were supposed to embody permanence and respectability. Yet often it's the mistresses who remain more vivid in popular memory. But what about the women themselves, beyond the gossip and dynastic ripples? Their lives were precarious. Some, like Bessie Blount, got pensions and respectable marriages. Others, like Dorothea Jordan, ended in poverty and loneliness. A mistress could be celebrated one year, scorned the next. She could shape politics one season and be erased from it the next. Survival required calculation, wit and luck, and yet despite all the danger, they left their mark. They bore children who carried royal blood into unexpected corners. They influenced kings in quiet moments no minister ever saw. They embodied the tension between love, lust, politics and power in a way no official court document could capture. It's tempting from our calm, modern armchair to imagine mistresses as schemers, the Barbara Villiers archetype, clawing for power and jewels. But many were more like Henrietta Howard, women navigating impossible choices, enduring roles they didn't want, simply because the king's attention left them no escape. Think of Anne Hastings, pulled into Henry VIII's orbit against her will, or Dorothea Jordan, who gave William IV decades of loyalty, only to be discarded when it no longer suited him. Behind the satire and scandal, there's often just a quiet sadness. Lives redirected, choices erased, dignity bargained away. And yet, through all of that, mistresses shaped the monarchy itself. They humanized kings. Charles II, for all his flaws, felt more real, more approachable, because of Nell Gwyn. George IV, bloated and self-indulgent, was judged through the lens of his mistresses, who became symbols of his excess. Even Elizabeth I, officially the Virgin, Gwyn was forever defined by the favorites she let hover close, feeding rumors that filled ambassadors' reports. The monarchy, that distant institution of crowns and ceremonies, became strangely personal through the presence of these women. Mistresses were the proof that kings and queens were just people, messy, emotional, insecure people, not marble statues. And then came Victoria, shutting the door. With her, the mistress tradition ended, at least in public. The monarchy reinvented, itself as sober, moral, family-oriented. It was a rebranding exercise for a new age. Industrial, middle-class, evangelical. The mistresses, once painted in oil and serenaded in poems, were suddenly embarrassing relics. Not to be mentioned, not to be celebrated, just tucked away in the footnotes of history. And yet, here we are tonight, remembering them. Because they were never really gone. Their descendants live on in dukedoms. Their stories linger in diaries and plays. Their laughter, tears, and compromises still echo faintly in the palaces they once inhabited. So, as we close this long, meandering tale, picture them one last time. Bessie Blount handing Catherine of Aragon her prayer book, while secretly carrying the king's child, Mary Boleyn, overshadowed by her sister, yet quietly surviving. Jane Poppincourt, teaching French manners and flirting at the edges of court. Barbara Villiers, storming through Whitehall like a hurricane in pearls. Nell Gwyn, tossing out jokes and oranges with equal ease. Henrietta Howard, quietly enduring until she could finally retire in peace. Dorothea Jordan, raising her Fitzclarence children with love, even as the crown slipped away. Forgotten lives, maybe, but not meaningless. Without them, the story of kings and queens would be strangely incomplete. So if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. The mistresses have had their moment again, however quietly, and history, in all its messy, ironic, and tragic detail, will still be there when you wake. Continental companions, Pompadours, Habsburgs, and a few too many Louises, if England slowly phased out its royal mistresses by the 19th century, France, on the other hand, turned them into something like an official institution. In fact, the French court came up with a neat phrase, maîtresse en titre, the chief mistress. Because yes, even mistresses came with titles, hierarchy, and paperwork. So let's begin with the most famous of them all, Madame de Pompadour. Madame de Pompadour, born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, was a middle-class Parisian girl who somehow made her way into the gilded world of Versailles. By sheer charm, intelligence, and calculated poise, she became the official mistress of Louis XV in the mid-18th century. Now, Louis XV had plenty of women before her, dozens really. He was the kind of king who treated mistresses like collectible figurines. Acquire one, display her, get bored, move on. But Pompadour was different. She didn't just provide companionship, she made herself indispensable. She threw salons filled with writers, philosophers, and artists. Voltaire, Diderot, even architects, all passed through her sphere. She steered Louis towards supporting the Enlightenment, well, selectively, commissioned palaces and porcelain, and became a cultural trendsetter. Ironically, her sexual relationship with Louis didn't last that long, but she stayed his closest. Confidante until her death, mistress first, best friend forever, proof that in Versailles, politics and intimacy were hopelessly entwined. But Louis XV wasn't satisfied with one Pompadour. He also created the infamous Parc aux Cerfs, essentially a private brothel, where young women were kept for his pleasure. Pompadour allegedly tolerated this, perhaps realizing she had more power as the stable, respectable mistress than by clinging to his bed. It's one of those things that's both tragic and absurd. Louis XV, the beloved, hiding in Versailles, with a secret harem, while his country inched toward revolution. It turns out the people weren't that thrilled about their taxes being spent on silk-lined bachelor pads. Who knew? Then came Madame de Pompadour's successor. She started life as Jeanne Bécu, illegitimate and poor, working in a fashion shop. By sheer charm and ambition, she climbed the ladder until she landed in Louis XV's bed. Unlike Pompadour, du Barry wasn't celebrated for her intellect. Critics painted her as frivolous, vain, and greedy, which probably says more about class prejudice than her actual personality. But she did become a lightning rod for resentment. Aristocrats sneered at her low origins, pamphleteers mocked her extravagance, and when the revolution came knocking, she became an easy target. Madame de Barry was eventually guillotined in 1793, pleading for her life. Not exactly the glamorous ending Versailles mistresses usually imagined. Of course, Louis XV wasn't the first French king to lean heavily on mistresses. His predecessor, Louis XIV, the Sun King, basically turned Versailles into a revolving doctor of royal favorites. Louis XIV married Maria Theresa of Spain, but spent much of his reign with mistresses like Madame de Montespan, who bore him several children. Montespan was witty, dazzling and commanding, but eventually got tangled in the infamous affair of the poisons, where accusations of witchcraft and black masses swirled around her. She fell from favor, but not before shaping the court. For over a decade, after Montespan came Madame de Maintenon, who started as a governess to his children, then became his companion, and eventually his secret wife. Yes, Louis XIV may have privately married his mistress. From scandal to sanctity, all in one career arc. So in France, mistresses weren't just tolerated, they became part of governance. A Louis without a mistress was almost unthinkable. Now let's drift over to Austria. The Habsburgs, of course, preferred to project an image of rigid Catholic virtue. Mistresses were for those decadent French Bourbons, not the serious, pious rulers of Vienna. Except the Habsburgs definitely had mistresses, they just pretended harder that they didn't. Take Emperor Francis I, husband of Maria Theresa. He had several affairs, which his wife tolerated with a weary sigh. Maria Theresa herself, that iron matriarch of the dynasty, wasn't amused. But she also wasn't about to blow up her marriage over it. She had 16 children to manage and a whole empire to run. Let Francis play, she had bigger things to do. Their son, Joseph II, was notoriously unlucky in love. He married twice, but both wives died young. He sought comfort in affairs, though none became long-term partners. He's remembered more for his reforms than his romances, but he too followed the unspoken Habsburg pattern. Official chastity, quiet indulgence. By the time we reach Franz Joseph I in the 19th century, the story takes a melancholic turn. Franz Joseph was married to the famously beautiful Empress Elizabeth, Sissi, but their marriage was emotionally cold. He turned instead to a series of affairs, the most lasting being with actress Katharina Schratt, who became his lifelong companion. In public, Sissi was the tragic empress. In private, Schratt filled the role of partner. The Habsburgs never admitted it outright, but the relationship was an open secret. Meanwhile, over in Spain, mistresses were practically part of the royal furniture. Philip IV of Spain fathered over 30 illegitimate children. 30. His court was practically a daycare. His official wife, Mariana of Austria, produced heirs too. But Philip spread Habsburg genes so liberally, it's a miracle Spain didn't collapse into even deeper dynastic chaos. Later, Charles IV of Spain took things to a new level by essentially letting his wife's lover run the country. Queen Maria Louisa openly favored Manuel Godoy, elevating him from guardsman to prime minister. Technically, this makes him a royal mistress in reverse, a royal paramour, if you will. The Spanish court didn't discriminate. Power and pleasure went hand in hand, no matter the gender, so across Europe the mistress wasn't a shameful secret. She was often a political player, a cultural influencer, or at the very least, an acknowledged part of the royal machine. France institutionalized her. The Habsburgs hid her. Spain tolerated her. England, as we saw, slowly phased her out. Different styles, same reality. Monarchs were rarely faithful, and mistresses were part of the fabric of royal life. And the irony is, many of these women shaped history just as much as the monarchs themselves. Madame de Pompadour influenced French art, architecture, even diplomacy. Madame de Maintenon steered Louis XIV toward religious conservatism in his later years. Dorothea. Jordan raised a generation of semi-royals who blended into the British elite. Katharina Schratt gave an emperor companionship during decades of political upheaval. All unofficial. All technically improper, yet undeniably important. And so, as the 19th century closed and monarchies struggled to survive in a democratic age, the mistress slowly faded into obscurity. By the time we get to the 20th century, a king having an open mistress wasn't charming anymore. It was a scandal. Just ask Edward VIII, whose affair with Wallis Simpson toppled his crown. But that's another story. The last mistresses, fading scandals and soft goodbyes. By the late 1800s, the idea of a king with an official mistress was starting to look outdated. The newspapers were everywhere, literacy was rising, and suddenly private liaisons could turn into very public scandals. What had once been a courtly tradition was now tabloid fodder. But that didn't stop a few royals from trying. Let's start with King Edward VII of Britain. Before he became king, he spent decades as the playboy Prince of Wales. His mother, Queen Victoria, was perpetually scandalized by him, which, let's be honest, wasn't very hard to do. Edward had a series of mistresses, most notably Alice Keppel. Alice was charming, witty, and socially adept. Exactly the kind of woman who could keep the boisterous prince calm. She remained close to Edward for years, and even when he finally became king in 1901, she was by his side. Her presence was so accepted that she was essentially part of the royal household. Here's the curious twist. Alice Keppel's great-granddaughter is Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla. Yes, the mistress lineage carried on, looping back into the crown itself. History loves a neat circle. Edward VII's mistresses were tolerated, even joked about. But by the time we get to his son, George V, things had changed. George was conservative, serious, and frankly rather dull. He stayed faithful to Queen Mary. No scandals, no mistresses. The age of casual royal infidelity was waning, yet in other courts, the tradition flickered a little longer. In Spain, Alfonso III had numerous affairs, many of them whispered about in Madrid cafes. He was handsome, restless, and far less discreet than he should have been. His dalliances became part of the gossip mill, though by then Spain itself was wobbling toward political disaster. The royal love life was just background noise to deeper national troubles. Meanwhile, over in Russia, the last Tsars weren't exactly famous for mistresses, but the wider Romanov clan had their share. Grand Dukes indulged, as Grand Dukes tended to, but Nicholas II was remarkably faithful to Alexandra. Unfortunately, their devotion didn't exactly save the dynasty. It turns out fidelity can't fix autocracy. The real end of the royal mistress era came in the early 20th century, when monarchies had to adapt to the modern world. Mass media left no room for discreet affairs. A king's mistress could now be photographed, reported on, mocked in the press, not just whispered about at court. And so, what had once been a glittering semi-official role, the companion. In silk, the secret queen in all but name, dissolved into scandal columns. By mid-century, the very word mistress felt archaic, a relic from a world of powdered wigs and candlelit chambers. Let's float here for a moment and take stock. We began centuries ago with women like Elizabeth Blount at Henry VIII's court. Their lives swept into dynastic storms they couldn't control. We drifted through mistresses who bore royal bastards, mistresses who whispered politics into their lovers' ears, mistresses who became cultural icons like Pompadour, and others who met tragic ends like Du Barry at the guillotine. Some were adored, some were despised, but all of them existed in that shadowy space just beside the throne, close enough to feel the weight of power, never quite allowed to hold it. And then, slowly, the lights dimmed. The 19th century pressed in. Monarchs had to look respectable, dignified, almost boring. Mistresses faded into footnotes. By the time Elizabeth II was crowned in 1953, the idea of a king with an official favorite belonged firmly to the past. So as we close tonight, let's let those long-dead figures drift back into the candlelight of their own time. The silk gowns, the powdered wigs, the whispered scandals in palace corridors. A world both glamorous and suffocating, where to be loved by a king was as dangerous as it was dazzling. And maybe, just maybe, we can be grateful we're not sleeping in drafty palaces, waiting to be summoned, hoping our fortunes don't collapse with the next royal mood swing. So that's where we'll leave it tonight. The forgotten lives of royal mistresses, from Tudor England to Versailles, from Vienna to Madrid. A parade of women who shaped history in ways official chroniclers often refuse to admit. Now it's time to let go of the gossip. Close your eyes and let the noise of centuries slip into silence. Good night and sleep well.